All right, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Brescher here. Today we're going to be learning about multiplying rational numbers. Specifically, our objective is that we'll be able to accurately multiply with rational numbers. And in this lesson, we're going to focus on integers and positive and negative decimals. So my goal is by the end of the lesson, you'll be able to solve problems just like these two that you see here. First, let's develop a little better understanding and try to use the number line to model and make connections with repeated addition and multiplication. So we have our first problem here, 3 times negative 3. And you're going to see parentheses used for multiplication in this lesson because there are decimals involved. So we don't really want to use the dot. And as we get older, we try to stray away from the x for multiplication. So that's why I'm using parentheses. But 3 times negative 3. Well, if we think about repeated addition, we would write this as negative 3 plus negative 3 plus negative 3, and it equals negative 9. If we model that on a number line, it's kind of like you're taking 3 leaps of negative 3. So negative 3 once, and then I'm going to go negative 3 again, and another negative 3, and notice we end up at negative 9. When we take 2 times negative 3, again we can think of our repeated addition. Negative 3 plus negative 3 equals negative 6. So this time we're making 2 jumps of negative 3. 1, 2. And we end up at negative 6. So those both make sense when we model it on the number line. Next, and notice we've got a pattern going on. 3, and then we've got 2 times negative 3 and 1 times negative 3. Of course, this one's easy because our identity property of multiplication says that when we multiply a number by 1, we get that same number. So when we take 1 times negative 3, we're going to get that same number, the identity property of multiplication. And here, when we multiply by 0, our zero product property tells us that any number times 0 equals 0. So these are all pretty easy to come up with. But when we keep this pattern up and we get into a negative 1 times negative 3, now we have to look for the pattern that's taking place over here. Negative 9, negative 6, negative 3, 0. That's right, we're adding 3 each time. So my next value is actually going to be 3. And negative 2 times negative 3, what'd you come up with? That's right, 6. So now we should be able to make a conjecture or some sort of rule or explanation as to what takes place. I think in first grade we came up, or excuse me, third grade when we started multiplying, we realized that a positive times a positive gave us a positive. Of course, then that's all we knew. And now we have a positive here times a negative, and we proved in 3 different examples that we always get a negative answer. So a positive times a negative equals a negative. Next, we have the commutative property of multiplication, which says that if you change the order, it will not change the value. 2 times 3 is the same as 3 times 2. So if we switch the negative to come first and then the positive, we still get the same value, a negative value. And finally, using our pattern, we can recognize that a negative times a negative equals, that's right, a positive. So we're going to apply some of these basic rules along with the rules to multiplying decimals to help us understand how to multiply positive and negative decimals. Let's move on. And here we go. In order to multiply with positive and negative decimals, we have to first be able to multiply positive decimals. So a quick rule when multiplying positive decimals, like this example. Multiply as if they're whole numbers. So instead of 3 and 4 tenths times 1 and 2 tenths, let's think of it as 34 times 12. 2 times 4 is 8. 2 times 3 is 6. I'm going to bring the 0 down since the 1 is in the tens place. 1 times 4 is 4, and 1 times 3 is 3. Then we add our partial products together. 8 plus 0 is 8. 6 plus 4 is 10. Put down the 0, and I'm going to carry my 1. 1 plus 3 is 4. Now, after we've multiplied as if they're whole numbers, all we have to do is count how many decimals are in both of our factors here. So I've got 1 decimal here and a decimal place here. Notice there's 1 place behind the decimal here and 1 place here. So that's 2 decimal places, and I'm going to move the decimal 2 places over in my product. And that's how you multiply with decimals. So, simple problem here, 75 times, or 75 hundredths times 5 tenths. We would do the exact same thing when multiplying this problem. Multiply as if they are whole numbers. So I would just take 75 times 5. 5 times 5 is 25. I carry my 2. 5 times 7 is 35, plus 2 is 37. And then I tack on those decimals, or add in those decimals. So I have a 0.75. There's 2 places behind the decimal here. And 0.5, or 5 tenths, there's 1 place behind the decimal here. That gives me a total of 3 places. So I'm going to move my decimal 1, 2, 3 places to the left, and then I would go ahead and add that 0 in front to get my answer of 375 thousandths. Now what happens if there's a negative? Like the example below, the same rules apply when we're multiplying with negatives, as we discussed and discovered on the previous page. So if we have a positive value times a negative value, we get a negative answer. Since 3 and 4 tenths times 1 and 2 tenths is equal to 4 and 8 hundredths, now I have a positive times a negative, so I'm just going to have a negative product, and I get the exact same answer, except for this time it's negative. For this next one, I have a negative times a negative, which we learned on the previous page by looking at the pattern. Then a negative times a negative gives us a positive product. So I'm going to get my positive answer of 375 thousandths. Moving on. Now it's your turn to practice. So we've got a couple other problems set up. Take some time, see if you can come up with the answers for these problems, and then I'll reveal the answer. All right, first of all, looking at this first problem, if we have a positive times a negative, you should have gotten a negative product. For the next one, a negative times a negative, you should have gotten a positive product. And this final one, a negative times a positive, is a negative. Now for the answers. All right, and there are your answers. Of course, in this one, you may have actually gotten this as your solution, which is the same as negative 3 tenths. This is just negative 300 thousandths. Over here, we get 51 and 3 hundredths. In our final one, how many decimal places did you have in your answer? You should have had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because that's how many decimal places there are behind, or places behind the decimal in our 2 factors. So the answer for this final question is a negative value, and you should have gotten 23 and 67,144 hundred thousandths. So I hope that helped you out in understanding how to multiply rational numbers. See ya!